They say the mountains remember what people forget. Out here, in the hollows of Appalachia, the land has a way of swallowing history whole generations, disappearing into the trees until only whispers remain. But sometimes, the whispers are enough to lead you back. There's a family in these hills that most of America wasn't meant to know about. A family that became a mirror held up to the country's most uncomfortable truths. They weren't monsters, they weren't demons, they were human beings born into a cycle that began long before they had a choice, and yet, what became of them would haunt anyone who dared look too closely. The story starts in a small coal mining region of West Virginia decades ago, a place carved out of isolation where the roads end before the world does. Generations lived and died without ever leaving the valley. There was no wealth, no schools worth speaking of, and no reason to expect anything beyond survival. Poverty has a way of bending people, folding them inward until all that's left is family, and when the nearest stranger lives miles away through miles of forest. Family becomes everything. The Whitakers, that's the name most people know. But the name isn't what matters. What matters is what they represent. The quiet decay of the forgotten class. The erosion of bloodlines left to their own devices in the cracks of the American dream. Locals say that when you first meet them, you don't know where to look. Their eyes, their movements strange, uncoordinated, almost animalistic. They bark instead of speak, or communicate through gestures and sounds no one else can decode. Outsiders recoil. Some film it, some laugh. But what most don't understand is that these people are not an accident. They are the natural end of a lineage that the world abandoned. It began innocently, cousins marrying cousins, brothers taking sisters' daughters as wives. In a town where every surname is the same, the idea of outsider barely exists. Over time, the family tree stopped branching altogether. It curled inward, tightening like a knot, and in that knot, something broke. The genetic consequences were cruel: deformities, cognitive impairments, a speechlessness that seemed to reach beyond language, as if the blood itself had grown tired of trying. Each generation carried the mistakes of the one before, until their very DNA became a map of suffering. But to them, this wasn't horror. It was home. For decades they lived unseen. Their home, a small, collapsing house surrounded by junked cars and barking dogs, became a fortress of obscurity. No phone. No running water. Just survival. A fragile community clinging to itself in defiance of everything outside. And then, one day, the world found them. A photographer and documentarian, drawn by rumors of the most inbred family in America, drove deep into the hills to find out if the whispers were true. He expected tragedy. What he found was something far more unsettling: the quiet dignity of people who didn't even know they were supposed to be ashamed. When he stepped out of his car, the first thing he noticed was silence, then the barking. The family didn't come out at first. They watched him from the shadows, eyes flickering through broken windows. He called out, introduced himself, but they only stared. Then, without warning, one of them, a man named Ray, began barking back. Deep, guttural, like a warning from an animal that no longer trusted language. The documentarian didn't run. He simply stood there, heart-pounding, until one of the older women motioned for him to follow her around the side of the house. That was how the world met the Whitakers for the first time, through the lens of a stranger brave enough, or foolish enough, to step inside. Inside the house, time had stopped. The walls were lined with photographs yellowed by age, their faces repeating across generations like reflections in a broken mirror. The air was heavy with the smell of rot and wood smoke. A single television flickered, running static on a channel that hadn't broadcast in years. He spent days there, slowly earning their trust, learning to communicate through gestures, grunts, and nods. What he discovered was both heartbreaking and profound: a family bound not just by blood, but by necessity. They looked after one another with a tenderness that the outside world had forgotten. To them, this was not a curse. It was simply the way things had always been. But the deeper he went, the more he realized that the real story wasn't about them, it was about us. About what happens when society draws its lines, decides who belongs, and forgets everyone beyond that border. These people were not hidden by choice. They were hidden by neglect. Generations ago, when the coal mines closed and the economy collapsed, the young and able fled. Those who stayed behind were the old, the poor, and the ones too entangled in the land to leave it. Isolation became inheritance, and inheritance became destiny. The Whitakers became an echo of something America wanted to forget, that poverty is not just about money. It's about distance, about silence, about being cut off from the flow of human progress until you begin to evolve separately, almost as another species. But evolution does not forgive. In the footage that exists, you can see it, the tension between innocence and unease. The documentarian asks simple questions, and the family responds in their own language of sounds and stares. There's a purity to it, a kind of primal truth. Yet beneath that innocence lies something tragic, the weight of centuries pressing down on a single bloodline that never had the chance to mix, to move, to escape. It's easy for outsiders to point and call it grotesque. But grotesque things are often born from neglect, not nature. These people didn't create their world. They inherited it, like a curse sealed long before they were born. Some say the family's ancestors were already isolated before the Civil War. Others whisper that it began with a single forbidden relationship generations ago, an older brother and his younger sister, who fled society to escape shame. No one knows for sure. What is known is that once it began, it could not stop. By the mid-20th century, their genetic pool had become a closed circle. Doctors who visited the area would occasionally make note of unusual birth defects or mental deficiencies, but those records rarely left the county. No one cared enough to intervene. No one wanted to look too closely. America was busy building highways, cities, and dreams, and in the shadow of all that progress, this family remained forgotten, unseen, enduring. When the documentarian finally released his footage to the world, it spread like wildfire. The internet did what it always does: it stared, judged, and moved on. People called it freakish, disturbing, grotesque. Few saw what he had really captured, a portrait of what happens when humanity collapses inward, and beneath the shock there was something else: guilt, because deep down every viewer understood this was not just a story about them. It was a reflection of what happens when we leave people behind. In the hills of West Virginia, the Whitakers still live, fewer now, older, their home slowly sinking back into the earth. The trees are reclaiming the yard. The roof sags with time, and every year fewer outsiders come to look, but the story remains. Hidden in those hills is a truth older than America itself, that isolation breeds decay, and neglect becomes its own form of cruelty. Because in the end, monsters are not born, they are made, and sometimes they are made simply by being forgotten. When the footage of the Whitakers first spread, most people didn't look away because it was shocking. They looked away because it felt wrong to look at all, like staring into a mirror that showed something too raw, too unfiltered, a glimpse of humanity stripped of every illusion. The comments online were merciless. People called them freaks, creatures, mutants. But for every cruel word, there was someone who felt something else: pity, sorrow, even fear. Not fear of them, but fear of what they represented. Because if this was what could happen when society looked the other way, what else was festering in the shadows? It's easy to believe that progress moves in one direction forward. But what if parts of America never moved at all? What if they just sank deeper, layer by layer, into the dirt? The documentary showed fragments of a world that time forgot. Ray, the eldest brother, barking at cars that came too close. Betty, sitting on the porch, her gaze lost somewhere between confusion and calm. Lorraine, her face weathered by both time and hardship, caring for her siblings as if the rest of the world didn't exist. The family dog, loyal and restless, pacing the perimeter of the house like a guardian of a secret no one else could bear. There was something almost biblical about it, the sense of punishment without sin, of suffering passed down like inheritance. When you looked closely, you could see the remnants of something once normal: old family photos, children's shoes, crosses nailed above doorways. Signs that this family had once been like any other, before the valley closed in around them. Somewhere along the line, the outside world forgot that these people had stories, names, feelings, but the land remembered. The mountains of West Virginia have always hidden more than they revealed. Coal towns that rose and fell overnight, mines that swallowed men whole, families that disappeared into poverty, their stories carried only by rumor. In a way, the Whitakers were not unique. They were simply the most visible symptom of something ancient, a wound that America never treated. Generations of neglect had carved them into existence. The coal companies took the land, the jobs, and eventually the people. When the mines closed, there was no escape. Schools shut down, doctors stopped coming, roads fell apart, the outside world moved on, and the people left behind made do with what remained. Inbreeding was not a choice. It was a symptom of isolation so deep that the very concept of stranger disappeared. But when the world finally looked their way again, it was not with compassion, it was with cameras. The documentarian himself, years later, admitted that what he found haunted him. He had not gone there to exploit them, but once the footage was out, it was no longer his to control. The internet fed on it. Reaction videos, dark humor, horror edits, all turning living, breathing people into a spectacle. The world turned a real American tragedy into entertainment, and that's when the haunting truth began to sink in. Every culture has its ghosts, the stories of people who were erased, ignored, or buried. But in America, our ghosts are often still alive. They live in forgotten towns, abandoned houses, and family trees too tangled to trace. They live in the places no one wants to visit, because visiting would mean admitting what we've done. The Whitakers became a kind of living ghost story, not because of what they were, but because of what they reminded us of. They showed us a side of humanity that civilization tries to pretend doesn't exist, the part that crumbles when stripped of contact, language, and opportunity. But what struck me most wasn't what the camera captured, it was what it didn't. The silences, the way Lorraine would hold Ray's hand when strangers approached, the way they fed each other before eating themselves. These small acts of care were almost tender. It was as if, in the absence of everything else, they had preserved one last fragment of what it means to be human, and yet we called them monsters. That word monster says more about us than it does about them. Monsters are what we invent to avoid guilt. If we can call something monstrous, we no longer have to ask how it came to be. There's a theory in anthropology that isolation doesn't just change people physically. It rewires the mind. When communities collapse, people turn inward, building entire worlds inside their own heads. Sometimes language disappears, other times morality shifts. Reality becomes what you can touch, see, and survive. That's what happened here, not because of evil, but because of absence. The family didn't lose their humanity overnight. It was stripped away piece by piece by generations of poverty, ridicule, and abandonment. Their silence wasn't ignorance, it was protection. When you've been hurt by every outsider who ever found you, silence becomes armor. And here's the part most people never consider. The family knew they were different. They knew the world saw them as strange. They just didn't care anymore. They had each other, and in their own language of gestures and grunts, that was enough. Sometimes I think about that house, the collapsing roof, the rusted cars, the narrow dirt road leading in, and the long silence leading out. It's easy to think of it as the end of something, a graveyard of bloodlines. But what if it's not the end? What if it's the beginning of an understanding we've been avoiding? Because if this can happen once in one hollow, in one forgotten corner of the richest country on earth, what else have we turned away from? Every year, researchers discover new pockets of genetic isolation across the world, in Appalachia, in the Ozarks, in small farming towns of the Midwest. Families trapped by poverty, addiction, and geography. The Whitakers were simply the ones who became visible long enough to be recorded. And that raises an even darker question: how many families are out there right now, living in silence, unseen by cameras, their bloodlines looping in on themselves as we scroll past on our screens? It's one thing to stumble upon tragedy. It's another to build a culture that forgets it exists. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you stay and protect them, or run and never look back? Because that's the choice that haunts this story. Every generation, someone could have left, but no one did. And with each passing year, the valley became more like a prison not built of walls, but of memory. The few outsiders who tried to help didn't stay long. Some brought food, money, clothes. Others brought cameras, pity, and judgment. But help, real help, never lasts when it doesn't understand the people it's meant for. To understand the Whitakers, you can't look down on them. You have to look sideways, to see not what they became, but what was done to them by a world that didn't care enough to ask why. And maybe that's the real horror, not their faces, not their voices, but the reflection of our own indifference staring back through the screen. Because when we label people as too far gone, we give ourselves permission to stop seeing them. And when we stop seeing, we stop feeling. And when we stop feeling, we stop being human. The Whitakers, for all their isolation and suffering, never forgot how to care for each other. In that broken house, in that haunted valley, they held on to something we've lost: unconditional loyalty. Family, no matter the cost. That's why, when you look at them long enough, the horror turns into something else: sorrow. And behind that sorrow, something even more dangerous: understanding. Because maybe the real secret of the most inbred family in America isn't their bloodline. Maybe it's the uncomfortable truth that, given enough neglect, any of us could end up the same way. There's a moment near the end of the footage when the documentarian stands outside the Whitaker house at dusk. The sun has just dipped behind the ridge, and the valley has gone quiet except for the sound of dogs barking in the distance. He doesn't speak. The camera just lingers on the house, on the rusted vehicles, on the faint glow from a single bulb inside. It's not a grand ending. There's no revelation, no redemption. Just the weight of everything unsaid. That's the moment you realize this isn't a story about inbreeding. It's a story about abandonment. About what happens when an entire people are cut off from progress and compassion, left to drift so long that they begin to change shape. And maybe that's the real secret buried in these hills, not that the family was strange, but that the world around them had grown too comfortable pretending they didn't exist. After the documentary came out, people from across the country wanted to help. Donations poured in, groceries were delivered, strangers drove from miles away to offer money or medical care. Some came with good intentions, others with curiosity, but most didn't stay long. You can't cure a century of isolation with a box of food. The family accepted what they needed: food, small gifts, clothes, then retreated again into their silence. Cameras came and went, voices promised change, but the land stayed the same. It always does. And yet something shifted. The world could no longer claim ignorance. The secret was out. But here's where the story turns darker. Because once the world knows your name, you stop belonging to yourself. The Whitakers became symbols of tragedy, of fascination, of something other. And that's a strange kind of prison. When the world calls you an oddity, it never lets you just be human again. That's the curse of exposure. Once you've been turned into a story, you stop being a person. Years later, people still visit that hollow, still film that collapsing home. Tourists in search of shock, hoping to capture a piece of the myth. Some come with empathy, others come with their phones raised, hungry for a spectacle. They don't understand that the story isn't over, it's repeating. Every time someone drives out there to stare, the same cycle begins again. Exploitation disguised as interest. The same thing America has always done to its forgotten children. There's a saying in the mountains, the dead never leave, they just change rooms. Maybe that's true for the living too. The Whitakers are still there, but in a way, they've already become ghosts trapped between a world that abandoned them and a world that now won't leave them alone. And maybe that's the cruelest fate of all, to be invisible for 100 years, and then to be seen for all the wrong reasons. What lingers isn't the image of their faces or the sound of their voices, it's the silence that follows. The way the camera drifts away and leaves you sitting there, unsure what to feel: pity, disgust, guilt, maybe all of it, because this family, in their quiet suffering, has done something most of us never could. They've shown the cost of being forgotten. You see, history doesn't just happen in wars and cities. It happens in the slow decay of homes like theirs, in families that fade one generation at a time until all that remains is rumor. There are hundreds of valleys like that across America. Places where bloodlines have turned inward, where poverty has erased language, where the outside world has simply stopped knocking. Every empire has its shadows, and these are ours. It's easy to look at the Whitakers and see only what's on the surface: deformity, poverty, inbreeding. But beneath that surface is something far more universal: the hunger for connection. Even in their silence, you can feel it, a longing that no one ever answered. The documentarian once said that, after he left, he couldn't stop dreaming about them. In his dreams, the valley was quiet and endless. The house was empty, and from somewhere inside came the sound of barking, not angry, not wild, just calling, as if the land itself wanted to be heard. Maybe that's what this story really is: the land calling out through the people who were left behind. A reminder that the forgotten don't stay buried forever. And if you listen closely, that call isn't just coming from the hills of West Virginia. It's coming from every broken town, every collapsed factory, every silent corner of the country where people are living ghosts of their ancestors' mistakes. This isn't just their story, it's ours. Because America is full of Whitaker families, not in name, but in spirit. People cut off from opportunity, surviving in the wreckage of promises that were never kept. They might not bark or grunt, but they speak in the same silence, the silence of those who have stopped expecting anyone to listen. Maybe that's why this story feels so heavy. Because somewhere deep down, we all know that it's not as far away as it seems. Isolation doesn't always look like a collapsing house in the mountains. Sometimes it looks like a quiet suburban street, where neighbors don't speak. Sometimes it's the loneliness of a man sitting in his truck after a 12-hour shift, wondering how his life ended up smaller than his father's. Sometimes it's a family line fading into addiction, shame, or despair, each generation repeating what the last refused to face. Inbreeding is just the physical reflection of something spiritual, a lineage that turns inward because there's nowhere else left to go. And when a whole country starts turning inward, generation after generation, maybe we all start to look a little like the Whitakers. That's the thought that lingers after the story ends, that the line between them and us isn't made of blood. It's made of distance, and distance can grow anywhere. So when you think about the most inbred family in America, try to remember what those words really mean. They're not a label, they're a warning that when we stop seeing each other, when we stop reaching across the divide, when we allow isolation to become normal, we begin to unravel, one generation at a time. The Whitakers' story is not beautiful, it's not uplifting, but it is true, and truth has a way of surviving even when people don't, because long after their house has collapsed and the trees have taken back the valley, the story will remain. Passed down in whispers, on screens, in uneasy conversations late at night. A reminder that behind every horror lies a history, and behind every history, a choice. We could have looked away forever, but we didn't, and now we can't pretend we didn't see. So the question becomes, what do we do with that knowledge? Do we let it haunt us, or do we let it change us? Because the real secret of the most inbred family in America isn't in their blood, it's in ours. It's in what we inherit when we choose silence over empathy, and in the end, maybe that's the thing the mountains have been trying to tell us all along, that if we forget the forgotten, someday we'll join them. The camera fades, the valley sleeps, the dogs bark once, then fall silent, and the story, their story, our story keeps echoing through the trees until someone else is brave enough to listen.